This problem has been brewing for decades.
We would simply run out of space by the end of the year if we didn't initiate some sort of early release scheme.
It has sent them into such a state of shock. It's re-traumatised them, and for many it feels like an injustice.
The cost of building a prison, the cost of putting someone in it, far outweighs the cost of supervising someone effectively.
What sort of society are we going to be living in if that's the standards we're keeping?
Here in the UK, a prisons overcrowding crisis in England and Wales has dominated the news agenda, with controversy surrounding plans to release inmates early to free up spaces in jail. Well, over the next 10 minutes or so in the big story, we'll explore what's behind the overcrowding crisis, and we'll look at how countries around the world, from Asia to Latin America, handle their prison populations and what can governments learn from different approaches. First, though, let's look at the situation here in England and Wales. Since 1900, the prison population has quadrupled in size, going from just over 17,400 to well over 80,000 today. This has put the prison system under enormous strain, and the prison estate is almost completely full. So let's bring in our correspondent, Tom Simons. And Tom, can you break down some of the figures behind this overcrowding issue and explain more about what's actually behind it?
Well, we've got 123 people in prison for every 100,000 people in the UK. Why? There is a demand for more punishment, a demand for longer sentences, for more people to go to prison, and fewer people are staying out for longer. So let me give you an example. The number of people being sent back under recall because they've breached their licence conditions, that's been going up over recent years. The Conservatives in 2019 increased the amount of time that serious violent offenders would have to stay behind bars, so that has also increased the prison population. They didn't increase the number of prison spaces. They did build some, but they also closed some, so there was very little change in the amount of prison spaces. There are too few staff, they lack experience, and the result is that the prison's inspector says this, that too many prisoners spend their days locked in their cells, overcrowded, lack of workshop space, instructors, equipment failures, ageing infrastructure. They have all compounded the problem. It is a crisis, Matthew.
Tom, back to you a little later. Let's take a look at how the situation in England and Wales compares with how countries around the world are dealing with overcrowding. Let's start with Europe, first of all, where many countries have seen an increase in their prison populations over recent years. That's according to data from the Council of Europe. The situation obviously varies from country to country, with different policies achieving very different results. Well, our correspondent Anna Holligan has this assessment of the situation on that continent.
Right across the continent, prisons are packed and under growing strain. According to those Council of Europe figures, more than 1.1 million people across Europe are now behind bars. Overcrowding is rising, and country after country shows that systems are close to breaking point. This isn't just a bureaucratic problem. So Hungary now has the highest prison rate, followed by Poland, Latvia, then Czechia. At the other end of the scale, Finland, the Netherlands, Denmark and Germany, with some of the lowest prison numbers in Europe. But even in countries that used to be seen as pioneering, they are struggling to cope, and the numbers are climbing. Many prisons are not only full, but they're seeing more complex problems. So aging prisoners, foreign inmates, more women in custody. And in many places, people are increasingly held in detention. They haven't even seen trial. They're still waiting for trial. So Europe's prison problem is partly about capacity, but it's also about policies that keep on pushing people towards those cells.
Well, let's drill down more. An interesting country to focus on in Europe is the Netherlands. On one hand, it has one of the lowest incarceration rates in Europe, but at the same time, it is experiencing its own problems with prison overcrowding. Here's Anna again on what's going on and what the Dutch government is doing about it.
Well, the Netherlands Prison still has relatively low incarceration rates, but that doesn't mean it's found a perfect solution. And in fact, the prison system is facing extreme pressure. So it's almost at capacity. They're short on staff. The government's trying to free up space with a mix of short-term fixes and long-term reform. It has just in the last few months released a new action plan. One immediate measure is to expand day release schemes so more detainees can work outside of prison under supervision, sometimes with an ankle tag before returning to sleep in prison at night. They're also considering extending various early release schemes. In the longer term, the Dutch cabinet's looking at reopening closed prisons, creating temporary capacity and improving how detention is faced, so giving more support to people coming to the end of their sentences in terms of finding work and housing in the community. But the fact that a country that was once seen as being innovative and praised for its approach to criminal justice is now facing a crisis within its prison system reflects the complexity of the task of bringing these prison numbers under control right across the continent.
Well, let's turn now to prisons in Latin America, where overcrowding is a chronic issue in several countries. As a result, some have adopted a controversial approach pioneered by El Salvador of building mega prisons, facilities which can house inmates in their tens of thousands. Well, let's bring in Mimi Swaby and Mimi, tell us about the situation across the region then.
Latin America has politically seen a shift to the right in recent years, and with that, leaders have increasingly promised or have actioned a tough stance of crime, really hammering down specifically on organised crimes, that's gangs and gang-related violence, as well as drug trafficking. And that, largely speaking, has led to high rates of incarceration and overcrowding in some countries and some more specific areas. Now, there is a heavy influence here from the US. Recently elected right-wing leaders, for example, in Chile and Colombia, they are allies of President Trump, who has very much declared a war on drugs entering the US, a lot of which come from Latin America, either being produced in Colombia, for example, or traveling through Latin America towards the US. Many people have kind of galvanized around the idea that many countries in Latin America, Ecuador, for example, was a relatively safe country not that long ago, but gang violence has completely turned that around, with the president now enforcing a very tough crackdown on crime. And that was something that voters asked for. He won a campaign promising that tough crackdown on crime. But interestingly, prisons in this region aren't just somewhere where the state house alleged criminals, they're also somewhere where criminal organizations have thrived, not only forming and governing, but really operating from those institutions. So it is a policy of mass incarcerations, mega prisons in some areas, which can and have backfired on authorities.
Well, let's look at El Salvador, because back in 2023, the country's president announced he was moving thousands of high-ranking gang members to the country's newly opened mega jail, the latest move in his nationwide crackdown on the gangs. Well, BBC Mundo used computer-generated reconstructions to reveal what life is like inside the cells in those mega prisons.
Data released by the Salvadoran government and documents seen by BBC Mundo, we've gathered information about the site. There are 8 cell blocks monitored by 19 watchtowers. Inside the cells, the beds are metal plates and there are 2 toilets open to the room. So far, the authorities say they have transferred 4,000 prisoners to the jail and that there is capacity for up to 40,000. The BBC has found that at full capacity, each person would have 0.58 square meters of space. The International Committee of the Red Cross recommends 3.4 square meters in a shared cell.
Mimi, tell me more about what we know about how the prison system is working there in El Salvador.
Well, El Salvador has the highest incarceration rate in the world per capita, and President Nayib Bukele has massively cracked down on gangs, but his kind of symbol of his leadership so far has been mega prisons, specifically the notorious Maximum Facility 1, CCOT. Now, that facility houses alleged gang members. It supposedly can house tens of thousands, but we do understand that it is already and has been running for a long time now over capacity. During his time in office, President Nayib Bukele has arrested more than 90,000 alleged gang members, many of whom are serving or have served time in Seacot. Like I said, this mega prison has become a symbol of his leadership. Not only is it a deterrent for anybody thinking about committing crime, it really has become a status symbol as well, something that he's incredibly proud of and he's winning votes and supports for in some areas. It has really cleared up the streets. He has arrested so many people who have been alleged or have been thought to have participated in some illicit activity, many of whom have not gone to trial yet, but so much so that many people in the country are praising him, saying, actually, we are living in a safer El Salvador, but it is at a cost of alleged human rights abuses, according to the UN and other human rights groups. So there is a flip side to this mass incarceration, but it isn't just mass incarceration and mass prisons, mega prisons in El Salvador, but also mass trials. Earlier this year, nearly 500 alleged gang members, all belonging to MS-13 gang, supposedly, they were put on trial virtually. They sat in a huge room, different rooms across the country, and heard their sentencing and heard their alleged crimes through a video screen. Anonymous judges behind that. That group was on trial for nearly 48,000 crimes. So very, very controversial measures and policies are being taken place in El Salvador. And that is just one instance of kind of mass trials and mass sentences. Individual sentences that we're seeing are incredibly hefty as well. Some individuals who've been convicted of being part of gangs and committing crimes, including murder, they have been given 1,000 years in prison. So the mega prison itself is a deterrent, but also President Nayib Bukele is really setting examples of how strong his crackdown on crime is and how strong his crackdown on gangs in particular are by these mass trials and mass sentences, or kind of very long, harsh sentences as well.
OK. Let's look at North America and the situation in the United States now, because the prison system in the US is enormous, with nearly 2 million people held in federal, state and local facilities, which means it has the largest incarcerated population in the world. Let's go back to Mimi. And Mimi, what do we know about the prison system there in the States and why so many people are behind bars?
So overcrowding in the States actually peaked in 2018, so a few years ago, but it does remain in a critical condition still. And this is largely due to a few factors, one of which is mandatory minimum sentencing. So individuals have to serve a mandatory number of years, and in a number of cases, offenders must serve the majority of their time. So a different system compared to other countries, which perhaps rewards good behaviour or other things, and people can be released early. Another thing is the government's war on drugs and taking a tough stance on crime more generally. Now, harsher sentencing for non-violent drug-related crimes since the 1970s has really ballooned the population, incarcerated population, and that is something that we are continuing to see. So more crimes are being incarcerated and for longer, so harsher, longer sentences. Another thing in the mix here is delayed parole processing. So people are, again, spending more time in prison, and that is on top of more people going into the system. Interestingly, certain states have experienced more severe overcrowding, and that is particularly in the Midwest. That is an area which sees a lot of overcrowding in its prison systems. Many prisons in that area are operating at over 90% of their intended capacity. Obviously, the United States is a very vast country. Many states have slightly different policies, different overcrowding issues, and different prison issues and kind of navigation in those systems. So federal and state laws play slightly differently, but widely speaking, the United States is really at a critical time with its prison system, specifically overcrowding too.
So that's the United States. Let's turn to Asia, because many countries in the region are also struggling with overcrowding. Here's Ambrasan Ethrajan on how some countries are dealing with that issue.
Overcrowding in prisons is a major issue in many Asian countries, like in China, India, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and even in countries like Sri Lanka. Sometimes they hold twice the number of prisoners what the jails can actually hold. Or in countries like in Sri Lanka, figures suggest there are 4 times more prisoners than these buildings can actually hold. So it is causing a huge issue in these countries, especially in terms of space, hygiene, food, and security. That leads to prison riots. For example, in Sri Lanka, there was a prison riot in which several people were killed, including prison guards, and the prison buildings were damaged. And that's why several Asian countries are now following various methods to reduce the prison population. For example, they are now establishing fast-track courts. In some countries, it's already in practice, where justice can be delivered quickly. And they're also pointing out that in most cases, almost 80 to 90% of the prisoners are either pre-trial or under-trial prisoners. So they want to give them bail in case if it is possible, and for even poorer people, those who can't afford to pay for the bail surety money, where the government can help them to fund these bail applications. That's another way they are looking at it. And paroles are extended, for example, in countries like Thailand, where they give suspended sentences and also extend the parole period. And from a practical point of view, many countries are now expanding their capacity, renovating old prisons. Many of these buildings could be colonial era buildings, and they're expanding their capacity, and also build new prisons and open air confinement center, and where people can be held for a short period of time, and it is not like in prison condition. So these are some of the ideas and some of the practices that countries are following.
Well, from Asia to Africa, over 2/3 of African countries have prison operating well above capacity, making overcrowding a real issue for governments across the continent. Here's Emery Makumeno from BBC Africa with more on that.
Data from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime shows Africa's imprisonment rate is about 94 prisoners per 100,000 people, below the global average and well below rates in the Americas and Europe. But lower incarceration rates have not meant less crowded prisons. Across much of the continent, facilities are operating beyond the capacity, often because large numbers of detainees are being held while awaiting trial. UNODC estimates that worldwide, 1 in 3 prisoners has not yet been sentenced, and in several African countries, remnant prisoners make up a substantial share of inmates. Lengthy court processes, limited legal aid, and case backlogs can leave people waiting months, sometimes years, for their cases to be heard. According to UNODC and the World Prison Brief, overcrowding continues to undermine healthcare, sanitation, rehabilitation, and safety. Experts say reducing unnecessary pretrial detention and speeding up justice processes will be key to easing pressure on prison systems.
So, what could England and Wales learn from how all of those countries are trying to deal with this same issue of prison overcrowding? Let's go back to Tom Simons. And Tom, clearly this is a global issue, but what kind of measures could work here, do you think?
Well, the government's going to try releasing prisoners early, not at 2/3 of their sentence for sentences over 4 years, but halfway through. Actually just taking us back to where we were in 2019 before the Conservative Party, when in power, made sentences longer. And for lesser sentences, releasing people at 1/3 of the way through their sentence, not at the halfway point or the 40% point, which was brought in a couple of years ago. But the other way, of course, is to build more prisons. And the Labour government has pledged to spend about £4 billion on building new prisons. Of course, that's going to take some time. But finally, the big idea, and this is from a former prisoner governor, instead of locking people up we're mad at, criminals, he says we should lock up people we are afraid of, so people who pose a risk to the population. He is advocating for fewer people to go to prison for less long periods. He says rehabilitation, making people offend less, works much better when they're out of prison in the community and properly supported. And so that is his prescription. The problem, of course, is that is not a particularly popular policy on the face of it, as many victims of crime have said in the last couple of weeks here.
Tom, thanks for taking us through that. And that is all you need to know about prison overcrowding and what different countries are doing to actually solve it.